Hey everyone, and welcome back to another boss guide for World of Warcraft. This week we start the Naxxramas Series with a first look at one of the hardest encounters that players will face during raid progression in Vanilla WoW. This fight features a frost resistance check that affects every player, along with a mix of unique and icy abilities that your raid will have to face. Today we'll be taking a look at the frost Wyrm known as Sapphiron. Sapphiron's Frost Aura is a raid-wide debuff that affects players during the entire duration of the encounter. Every 2 seconds, players will be receiving 600 frost damage from this ability. However, this damage can be reduced by using frost protection potions and wearing frost resistance gear. Sapphiron features a much stronger and chaotic version of Blizzard than any other boss in Vanilla WoW. This type of blizzard randomly drifts across the room and does roughly 3000 to 4000 damage per tick, making it incredibly lethal to players. During the encounter, Sapphiron will place life drain on multiple players that is visualized by a green fire effect. This is a cursed ability that deals heavy shadow damage to the player while also healing Sapphiron over time. Mages and druids can remove this debuff from nearby players, and it's recommended to use a shadow protection potion before the fight starts to help absorb this damage. Just like other dragons, Sapphiron has a cleave effect on targets in front of him, which means that he will need to be faced away from the raid. Make sure to also stick to his sides if you're not the tank, due to his tail swipe ability that knocks players away. At roughly 45 seconds into the encounter, Sapphiron will then take off into the air and begin launching ice bolts at random players. These ice bolts deal heavy frost damage to players, as well as having a splash effect on nearby targets. It's recommended to save your frost potions for this ability due to the heavy burst damage while also making sure to spread out from nearby players. Being hit by an ice bolt will turn your character into an ice block, which is related to his next and final ability. After 5 ice bolts have gone out, Sapphiron will begin channeling his ultimate ability, known as Frost Breath, for several seconds before sending it to the ground. Players will need to stand behind the ice blocks to survive, as this ability kills any player in its line of sight. After this, Sapphiron will return to the ground and repeat the same rotation of abilities, meaning that players will have to adjust to his ground and air phases. During the ground phase, raid positioning for Sapphiron is very basic, with the key points being to keep him face from the raid, stick to the sides if you're a DPS or a healer, and avoid his blizzard ability. For your raid groups, make sure that each group has at least 1 healer, and that mages and druids are on both sides to assist with decursing life drain. Moving on to the air phase, this is where it's recommended that your raid shifts toward a V formation, so that ice blocks are closer and easier to run to, rather than relying on the RNG aspect of ice bolts. Aside from that, try to be at least 10 yards from other players, and remember not to group up behind ice blocks until Frost Breath has been cast, because the splash damage from Ice Bolt can lead to multiple people being killed. After this, Sapphiron will then return to his ground phase. Coming up next, we'll go over frost resistance and how much you'll need for your class and role. Starting with the main tank, typically they'll be using almost 0 resistance gear, because Sapphiron is an incredibly hard-hitting boss, and it's best to use defense and mitigation gear to offset this. However, in some situations I have seen tanks use a certain amount to help their healers with damage during the air phase, but ultimately I'll leave this to your best judgment and guild situation. With healers, this is possibly the most important role in this encounter, as this is one of, if not the most healing intensive fight in Vanilla with so much raid damage going on. It's best to run with 70 to 110 frost resistance unbuffed, since the biggest thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to reduce your healing too much on a fight like this. Finally, for progression, it's recommended that guilds bring 14 to 16 healers just for this fight, and to be more specific, paladins and shamans are of incredibly high value, not just because of their abilities, but due to their totem and aura that gives frost resistance to their group. For mages and warlocks, it's ideal to find a sweet spot between 130 to 175 unbuffed, depending on your guild situation, and if you have a paladin or shaman in your group. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that you need to focus on having enough mana to cast spells to do consistent damage, so make sure not to go overboard with your resistance gear. For melee DPS and hunters, the ideal range for you guys will be between 210 to 250 unbuffed, which should result in frost attacks being reduced by half. Fortunately, warriors and rogues aren't limited by mana, which means that they're able to be more flexible with their gear sets based on their playstyle and guild tactics. But the goal in the end should be taking the stress off your healer's shoulders on a fight like this that is very challenging for progression. Finally, to close out this section, I cannot stress enough that your guild should focus from day 1 on collecting frozen runes and word of thawing items inside Naxxramas. The frozen runes are needed to craft the epic frost resistance gear, but to loot them, you'll need the word of thawing item that drops off the trash mobs. Having this gear will help a lot on Sapphiron and KT, and lead to fewer healers needed, and better survivability in these fights for your guild. Now to recap everything that we've gone over, the fight starts with odd groups moving to the left side of Sapphiron, and even groups moving to the right. The main tank will place himself in the middle of the room, and grab the boss and move him away from the raid once he spawns. During the ground phase, make sure to stand close to your paladin or shaman if you have one in your group. You can also put raid markers on them to make them stand out more. As we start getting into the fight, there are several abilities that you'll want to focus on avoiding, such as Blizzard, and make sure to stick to the sides to avoid being hit by Cleave and Tailswipe. At the same time, if you're a druid or a mage, then make sure to decurse life drain off players as well. During the air phase, your raid will then move into a V formation around the side of the room. Make sure to save your frost protection potions for this phase, as it helps absorb the heavy damage from ice bolts. While in the air, Sapphiron will fire 5 ice bolts at random players in your raid. Because it has a splash effect, make sure to stay spread out, and remember not to group up behind ice blocks until all 5 ice bolts have gone out. Sapphiron will then use his Frost Breath ability, and to survive this, every player has to stand behind an ice block because this ability kills anything in its line of sight. After this happens, Sapphiron will return to his ground phase, and you should move back to your original location and regroup with your healer. Following this, the fight proceeds the same way, with your raid adapting to his ground and air phases that he cycles throughout the encounter. While his abilities aren't as complex as others in Vanilla WoW, the biggest thing about this fight is having the gear to deal with the resistance check, along with a healthy amount of raid consumables. This encounter focuses on being an attrition-based fight, where balancing your survivability with your healing or damage is key, though fortunately the first time you fight Sapphiron will likely be your hardest, as better gear leads to faster kill times, and a less reliance on resistance gear. But that pretty much wraps up this week's boss guide for Sapphiron. Hopefully this information is useful to you in the present and future. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time as we explore more of the original version of Naxxramas from Vanilla World of Warcraft.
Fools! You think yourselves triumphant? You have only taken one step closer to the abyss.